Hey guys. So surely you've all heard of Jack the Ripper, possibly the world's most notorious serial killer who passed his time with the murder of sex workers in the 1880s in London. Or maybe you've heard of the Green River Killer. His real name was Gary Ridgway, and he made his reputation off the murder of a number of sex workers in late 90s America. He remains America's most prolific confirmed serial killer to date. The Long Island serial killer also made it a habit to kill sex workers. So did Canadian killer Robert Picton, as well as English murderer Steve Wright. And it's not just the famous or semi-famous serial killers of the last century and a half who have had a problem with one of the world's oldest professions. For pretty much as long as there has been sex work, there's been violence directed against those who practice it. And, as discussed on the podcast of the Lotus Eaters recently, the same fate is now being meted out to the modern escorts who sell themselves to thousands of men at a time. OnlyFans girls.
Right, so OnlyFans, in my view, is the worst thing that has happened to womanhood. And there is an increasing evidence to suggest that this is objectively the case, because it emerged yesterday that an OnlyFans model was stabbed to death in a guest house before being found by her friends.
Bloody hell.
Yeah, the lifeless body of Melanie Juarez, 21, was found with at least 14 stab wounds on Monday in Rosario, Argentina. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that this was an impassioned crime. And unfortunately, well, this is again suggested by the evidence that I dug up today. So if we move on to the next one. Unite Geigner, I can't pronounce it, whose social media name was Miss Mercedes Moore, was found strangled on Sunday by her father Mark in her Houston, Texas apartment. So this is another OnlyFans model who was murdered. I think
but this time by her father.
Not by her father. She was found by her father.
Oh, found by her father.
Found by her father. She was actually, I believe, murdered by an admirer. I'll give the overview of this story. Kat West, known to her online fans as Kitty Cat, dear God, was found dead in the streets near her at Alabama home wearing just her pink sports bra. Her husband Jeff was later found guilty of reckless manslaughter.
So not even premeditated murder.
Not even premeditated murder.
So this was an act of rage.
Yeah. To give you a short version of the story, they were basically, I think, on holiday, went out somewhere. Had a bit of a boozy night. Everything was going absolutely fine, and then of course he had a little bit too much. And I think on the way home, they obviously got into an argument. He burst into a fit of rage. Obviously, ended up killing her, and he ended up trying to lie his way out of it. But in the end, he was done for reckless manslaughter or involuntary manslaughter, whatever the equivalent is.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, the killers I mentioned before were all sick, psychotic sons of bitches. Literally, in some cases, there is a strong correlation between overbearing or abusive mothers and men who grow up to be murderers, conquerors, etc. And while their actions cannot be morally justified, there is also a very plain-to-see message in the pattern as it's been laid out. Blood and lust go hand in hand. And there's nothing surprising about that. Sex and violence are the two most primitive forms of human behavior. They're more overtly instinctual and animalistic than almost anything else that we do. And if we're all honest with ourselves, we know that sex and violence intersect in a, shall we say, interesting ways. And don't give me a skewed look. If you've ever spanked or been spanked by a lover, then you know that there is an overlap between sex and violence, even for those of us who would not consider ourselves psychotic. Right? There are degrees to the overlap, but it's there, and we pretty much all know that it's there, whether we know that we know it or not. And it's not really even about sex or violence. It's about something deeper, something primal that we tap into when we're in situations that reveal us for the animals that we really are under all the layers of civility. Think about it. One of the most common female sexual fantasies is the rape fantasy, reportedly. And it doesn't take a genius to recognize that more men than may have been expected harbor cuckold fantasies of their wives or girlfriends sleeping with other men. In both cases, the act being fantasized about is potentially one of the more deeply scarring acts that either party could be subject to. It's the application of another's power in violation of one's own emotional, physical, or yes, genetic integrity. And in truth, the vast majority of the time, a fantasy is just a fantasy, and it should stay that way. Explore it with someone you trust within relatively well-defined boundaries, safe words and all that stuff. But then that brings us back to the OnlyFans conversation, where the lines between fantasy and reality seem somewhat blurred, and people mess with their own and others' instincts and insecurities on an industrial scale, without seeming to know what they're doing, because oftentimes they're quite young and just don't understand certain things about themselves or others. Now, make no mistake, while I've seen OnlyFans directly compared to hookers, in many, many cases and in many, many ways, they're morally far worse, far more detrimental for society as a whole. Whether or not they actually provide sex, sex is what they're selling. And with that point, I want to quote St. Augustine on the topic of prostitution. He said, "If you expel prostitution from society, you will unsettle everything on account of lusts." These OnlyFans girls aren't the prostitutes, even if they're sometimes also that. They're the lust manufactured on a scale far beyond the ability of the OnlyFans girl to genuinely satisfy and deliver to a population of lonely and, I imagine, emotionally and sexually unfulfilled men. So men who are not all necessarily in the best headspace. That's going to unsettle things. And while none of the girls who have been killed by disillusioned fans or aggravated husbands deserved it, and they all deserve at least some sympathy, it's also an unsurprising reality that the profession or pastime they've chosen is going to attract some undesirable attention. And in some cases, that's going to be very dangerous. I don't blame them for their victimization any more than I blame a boxer who dies from injuries sustained in the ring, but the reality is that some professions carry more inherent risk than others. It's up to the individual to decide what they are willing to take those risks for. It is no secret that certain industries, illegal or not, come with baggage. The trade of sex is most certainly one of them, and it pretty much always has been. That's why, before the age of the internet, it tended to be a profession chosen only by women in desperate circumstances. Sexual instincts are inextricably tied to the biological imperative, the deep-seated drive to procreate, to perpetuate one's own line. It's not impossible to control those drives, and I encourage men to do exactly that, and control those drives. But that doesn't mean it's reasonable or smart to tamper and meddle with those instincts. And if you choose to do so on a large enough scale in front of a large enough audience, it is almost unavoidable that a couple of the men watching you will not be entirely sound of mind. In one of the videos I did before my hiatus, I commented that violence against women is often driven by a desire for women. I think we're going to keep seeing examples of that playing out, and they will often be labeled misogynistic. But I stand by my assertion that there needs to be a cultural perception change in how men view women, as well as in women's willingness to try and understand the male perspective. For too many men, ego and self-perception are over-dependent on the status of our relationships with women. And too many women know that that is one of our weaknesses, and they readily play into it. Others don't even try to play into it, but there's a lack of understanding of the evolutionary psychology of men and women that leads us to interacting in ways that can negatively impact our inherent natures. And pointing out that certain behaviors increase risk is not a victim blaming. Just like if I see someone get run over by a car while crossing the road with their eyes closed, pointing out that they should keep their eyes open is not a victim blaming. And if it is victim blaming, then victim blaming is good because it contributes to a reduction in victims. Anyway, guys, that's all I've got on that. Hit like, hit subscribe, and I'll catch you for another rant later. Cheers.